than it was practical. So you see, breaking up big companies, the concept is so broken that every important stakeholder has broken up with the idea. Now, let's move into the present, see if my opponent's stance has any hope. My opponents might argue that these companies have become too powerful that they threaten democracy. However, when a company is incorporated, it enters into a legally binding contract with the government. And as such, the government has the power to determine how these companies run. For example, in 2018, according to the Cointelegraph, Facebook was made to pay a $5 billion fine for data privacy violations, including the 2018 Cambridge Analytica data privacy scandal that they mentioned. So you see, this just shows that companies lose many legal battles because this is not Nigeria. Even if you think you are too big to fail, you are certainly not too big to be punished by the law. Furthermore, in addition, according to Investopedia, there are laid down conditions for which a company can be broken down. One, if it's a monopoly. Two, if it's anti-competitive on monopolies. According to Economic Times, a monopoly is a market structure characterized by a single seller selling a unique product. It is then obvious that these companies, despite their dominance, are in no way monopolies, because for every iPhone, there is an Android, and for every Facebook, there is Twitter. Also, an important indication of a monopoly is the ability to unfairly control the market. But if tomorrow, WhatsApp started charging 10,000 naira for users to use its messaging app, do you really think people would continue using it? A monopoly that cannot even unfairly control the market, is that your monopoly? Two, competition. Big companies help smaller companies thrive. According to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, there are about 305 million startups created each year, leveraging on the services that these big companies provide. For example, a company like Uber. Uber is a $91 billion company built off innovation, ingenuity, and oh yes, Google Maps. This just shows that it is on the giants of these big companies that other small companies stand. Now, let's move into the future and imagine a world where these big companies break up. My opponents might argue that breaking up these big companies will solve any underlying market issues. However, as the American Enterprise Institute explains, the economies of search, social media, e-commerce have determined what are today's market structures. Breaking up these big companies would not reverse these economic realities. What would simply happen is that these market structures would reemerge. Put simply, the reason why people use WhatsApp is because a lot of their friends use WhatsApp. And if for any reason WhatsApp goes down, people will simply pack their bags, move to a new place, and then that new place becomes the big company. So you see, these companies are not good because they are big. They are big because they are good. In conclusion, breaking up big companies has failed the test of time. And if we follow it, we would only have smaller companies with structures not good enough to support us, defenses not smart enough to protect us, and resources not great enough to satisfy us. Today, my opponent's speech might make you marvel, doctor you to strange things, or even make you snap. But remember, just like Thanos, their intentions may be valid, but their solutions are far from home. And to the Obafemi Awolowo Hall, welcome to the end game. From the only hall known for its fame, Mubarak Lawal is my name.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's make some clarifications. Today's debate is not asking whether big companies like Amazon and Facebook should be sent off the market. Neither is it saying that these big companies should go into extinction. No, we will agree that indeed these big companies make our world glow. However, with regulators breaking big companies like Amazon and Facebook, our road to freedom is assured, and I will review how in today's debate. First, for the protection and promotion of public interest, we cannot allow the powers of these big companies to go unchecked. According to an article published on Protocol on March 15, 2021, titled How Tech Workers Feel About China, AI and Big Tech's Tremendous Power, a survey which was carried out revealed that over 77%, I repeat, 77% of tech employees agreed that companies like Amazon, Facebook, and Google are too powerful. With the volume of information amassed by these companies and the rampant cases of breaches, the interest of the public is at stake. Thus, in order to curtail the excessive powers of these companies and ensure the protection of this generation and those to come, I say this is the time to act. Second, for safety, these companies should be broken up because they enrich themselves at the expense of the safety of the users. This was exemplified when Frances Hudson, the Facebook whistleblower, filed several complaints against the company as regards its approach to safety, as reported on The Guardian on October 5th, 2021. This complaint covered several issues as regards the company's approach to human trafficking, tailored to mental health, to mention but a few, which are core toward health and security, and makes one wonder if the gain truly outweighs the pain. Should we close our eyes to these disastrous happenings? I said no. This is the time to act. Furthermore, my opponents may come here and say that these companies are irreplaceable and have proven over time to be capable of leading the tech world. But may I remind them that according to a post on the Washington Post, these companies have been accused of being illegal monopolies that have hampered innovation and engaged in anti-competitive behavior. Yet, my opponents still choose to close their eyes to the truth. For instance, Facebook acquired WhatsApp and Instagram. Google has acquired over 270 companies since 2001. Should we wait until Amazon shows interest in acquiring our almighty Tether Hall cafeteria? Thus, in order to create space for increased innovation, I say again, this is the time to act. Ladies and gentlemen, judges, may we go down memory lane on a day I am sure everyone would remember vividly. The social media giant Facebook and its subsidiaries WhatsApp and Instagram were globally unavailable to users, which answers the first question of today's debate. But for the benefit of my dear opponents, I strongly reiterate that these companies are not too big to fail, and regulators should break them up. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, when we realized that tobacco companies were hiding the harms it caused, we took action. When we figured that cars were safer with seatbelts, we took action. So I say to you today, this is the time to act. Thank you.
In a fair race for 10 people, 3 people take the lead, but are brought back just because they've gone ahead of others. Unbelievable, but this same way is how our opponents justify breaking big companies. Therefore, to conclude the battle of what is right or wrong, allow me walk you through a race of truth and sensibility through these 3 questions. 1, who benefits? 2, what happens next? And 3, who is harmed? To the first question, who benefits? According to Wharton School, breaking big companies will divert more profit to other businesses at the expense of the companies to be broken, as they will still be struggling from this effect, thereby bringing those at the back of the race to the front, and those at the front a little backwards. The first becomes the last becomes the first, because the first is guilty of being the boss. Breaking big companies is not beneficial to the companies involved. I know this. I have shown this by truth and sensibility. 2, what happens next? Ladies and gentlemen, the practicality of breaking companies like Facebook and Amazon is too fragmented and may lead to failure. According to Code Fusion, YouTube usually runs at a loss and gets funds only as being part of Google. If these companies are separated, YouTube will suffer an obvious lack of income and fail. So whether it is Facebook by Mark Zuckerberg or Instagram by Mark Zuckerberg, it won't matter which Mark owns the company if the mark of failure unmarks the tangible presence of Mark in the labor market. My opponents will say breaking big companies will stop instability, like the case of Facebook and WhatsApp going down together during several issues. However, this stance is wrapping truth and untruth together. The untruth, a few hours crash is sufficient grounds for breaking them. Untruth separated. Now the truth, the combination of these companies is what makes them strong enough to have the resources to cater to billions of people. To the third question, who is harmed? According to the New Yorker, the sale of LinkedIn to Microsoft was to help LinkedIn operate at an extraordinary scale, truly pay their workers what their talent is worth, and deliver the major purpose of the platform. What my opponents don't know, but attempting to pull them back from the race, is that these big companies run the race for companies who can't run the race themselves. Furthermore, my opponents might come here to say that CEOs of big companies bully smaller companies. However, this is a crybaby argument, as the government already puts regulations in place to control these unethical market practices. So you see, breaking big companies is not the solution to market bullying, but only by making sure that laws enforce smaller companies from facing big companies. Finally, my opponents might come here to say that breaking big companies will stop market instability, but market instability is not the cause to market instability. Finally, thank you.
Are you ready? Remains, we are then left with no option but to guide our world economy jealously. My opponents have argued that breaking big companies is ineffective. They further argue that these big companies are able to achieve their status by promoting innovation and low prices. They further said again that governments cannot break them up, rather they should punish them.
You see, the irony is that all of these points have been reported in our speech as we established that these companies did not get to the position they are today just because they offer better services or lower prices, but rather by using their strength against smaller companies, killing them from ever being able to compete with them or be disruptive to their market. Again, the second speaker argued that these big companies are breaking them up will work against them because they gain power from their strength, from being together, from being a whole. That breaking them up will work against them. However, we are talking about society now. We cannot, because of the interest of a few, sacrifice the whole society. So again, 19 days ago, Facebook crashed and the entire world literally crashed. Today, the only thing that will crash are my opponent's chances at the finals. Thank you.
It is obvious that my opponents don't understand the meaning of monopoly, the difference between monopoly and market power, because they said that the two of them are the same. But for example, if Class Restaurants owned all the restaurants in UI and you're forced to shop at a Class restaurant, that is a monopoly. But if Class's food is so sweet that you have no choice but to eat at a Class restaurant, that is market share. Now, they said privacy. We also said in our speech that Cambridge Analytica was something that Facebook was severely punished for. Then they said it is possible. So they based the fact that big companies should be broken up based on the possibility. And they should understand that tech companies now differ. They are not like Standard Oil, because the services, the servers, the pages that load all these things up are intertwined. And as such, breaking up these companies is complex. Also, the mention of safety, mental health, trafficking. It is obvious that they are just looking for excuses for why these big companies to break up. Because mental health issues are things that the regulators already take control of. So it is only when you can say the reason why you should break up a big company is something that would help solve an issue. You'd only be dividing problems into two. Thank you very much.
Moving forward, we have the second battle of our hall category, and this is between Ransome Kuti Hall and Alexandra Brown Hall. Put your hands together. Ransome Kuti Hall versus Alexandra Brown Hall. They will be speaking on the topic, mass surveillance by the government in the 21st century, justifiable. For the supporting, we have Ransome Kuti Hall, and opposing, we have Alexandra Brown Hall.
Ladies and gentlemen, having many eyes watching you is not always a bad thing. I mean, if my opponents were celebrities walking on the red carpet, I suppose they wouldn't mind the camera flashes here and there. But you see, we are here to debate a more useful use of cameras. And to this end, I have 4 letters for my opponents today. CCTV. The first C, context. Dear audience, one thing we must be aware of is an inaccurate presentation of mass surveillance. For instance, Privacy International is a non-governmental organization that believes governments and corporations use technology to exploit humans. It is therefore not surprising to have such an organization give biased definitions of mass surveillance, such as an indiscriminate surveillance system that creates fear in the hearts of people. What we need is a neutral definition by a neutral body. So if I may, according to the Council of Europe in a 2018 thematic fan sheet, unlike targeted surveillance, which is hidden, mass surveillance is the open collection of conversations, telecommunications, and metadata by technical means. The Council further noted that due to its potential to infringe on the fundamental rights of privacy and freedom of expression, member states must ensure that the development of mass surveillance is accompanied by the simultaneous development of legal safeguards securing respect for the citizens' human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, what this means is that mass surveillance and the enjoyment of the right to privacy and freedom of expression are realities that can coexist in any given society. So even if we don't have a perfect example now, that perfect example can be progressively realized by the deliberate effort of any willing government. For more context, my opponents may mention countries like China as bad examples of governments that use mass surveillance, or even worse, mention other countries that rank higher in global security rankings, such as Iceland and Portugal, only to show that mass surveillance is not needed. But you see, what we must understand is that the circumstances of these countries are just too different to use them as proper comparisons on the suitability of a mass surveillance system. For instance, according to a 2021 report by Statista, Iceland has an approximate population of 400,000 people, while according to the same source, China has an approximate population of 1.5 billion people. Applying the same digital security for 400,000 people to 1.5 billion people is like applying the same medication for headache to Ebola virus. The failure will go viral. The second C, clarity. Ladies and gentlemen, for the purpose of mutual clarity, allow me to give us a brief lesson on justifiability. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, in a 2016 article on reasons for action, there are two types of reasons that justify an action. First are the normative reasons. These are normal objective reasons that justify an action. For instance, I am a student and have a class by 5 p.m. These normative reasons justify my attending the class. But secondly, there are motivating reasons, which are reasons that the person takes to justify his actions. Thus, unlike normative reasons, these are subjective reasons an individual uses to justify his action. So while I have a class by 5 p.m., I choose to use that time to watch a football match and justify my action by saying, life is too short to not spend doing the things we love the most. Dear audience, in applying this reasoning, we realize today's topic does not ask if mass surveillance by the government is justifiable to my opponent. Neither does it ask if it is justifiable to the people. It simply asks, is it justifiable? This means whether the reason is a normative or a motivating one, as long as it is one of both, it is justifiable. And since what motivates the government to use mass surveillance is the belief that that is what it needs to guarantee the security of its citizens, mass surveillance by the government is justifiable. Moving on to the letter T, time. The 21st century is a time of immense technological development. Dangerous terrorist groups are thus leveraging on these modern technologies to execute their dubious plans. This begs the question, should we not also leverage a modern technology to counter terrorism? This is why, according to the United States Legal Incorporated, nowadays, governments perform mass surveillance of their citizens so as to protect them from dangerous groups such as terrorists and criminals. Adopting mass surveillance to counter terrorism is thus a step in the right direction. Anyone that opposes this step, although not a terrorist, is a terror to resist. Finally, the letter V, valediction. We have all had compelling reasons why mass surveillance by the government is justifiable. So as I conclude my speech, I have a few parting words of advice. To the governments that struggle with national security this year, my advice is to try mass surveillance next year. And to my opponents, my advice is similar. You can try again next year. Thank you.
Judges, we are not here to debate the abuse of mass surveillance because the use of mass surveillance is in itself an abuse of data collection and privacy. According to Privacy International, mass surveillance includes the use of mass hacking, phone trackers, CCTV, and facial recognition technology for the indiscriminate collection, analysis, and generation of data on a large number of people. So you see, there cannot be a misuse of mass surveillance when its existence is already an abuse. To properly understand mass surveillance by the government and why it is not justifiable, we will explain it the way Reverend Israel Oladapo Ransome Kuti would have done. He probably would have started with the book of Proverbs 30 verse 12. There is a way that seemeth right to a man, but the end thereof is destruction. Beloved Kutite, your stance here today may seem right to you. However, it stands for the destruction of national trust, economic downturn, and violation of human rights. 1. The use of mass surveillance by the government is not justifiable because it is too expensive for its so-called gains. A U.S. Federal Appeal Court ruling on September 2nd, 2020 found that despite spending $10 billion every year, the National Security Agency showed no evidence that its surveillance program stopped any terrorist attack. Now, imagine how much it would cost if every country implements some form of mass surveillance, paying so much only to gain nothing. In fact, the money spent on mass surveillance can be used to prevent the root causes of insecurity, such as poverty and unemployment. So you see, mass surveillance is not security in place, but a priority misplaced. At this point, Reverend Israel Oladapo Ransome Kuti will quote Isaiah 55 verse 2. Why shall you spend money on that which does not satisfy? 2. The use of mass surveillance by the government is not justifiable because it infringes on individual fundamental rights. According to the Council of Europe's Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights, mass surveillance threatens the right to privacy, fair trial, freedom of religion, information, and expression. Our opponents may state that mass surveillance is for the greater good of the state and we should sacrifice our human rights on the altar of security. However, at its core, the state is made up of a mass of individuals, and the good of the individuals make up the good of the state. Therefore, what is bad for the individuals is bad for the state. Proverbs 21:3. Doing what is right overrides sacrifice. 3. The use of mass surveillance by the government is not justifiable because it leads to a breakdown of law and order as it promotes distrust between individuals and the government. According to an article titled Trust in Government, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development found that trust is crucial for the success of public policies, as distrust will lead to a lack of cooperation and a breakdown of law and order. Trust builds the foundation of a nation's development, and mass surveillance destroys this very foundation. Proverbs Psalm 11 verse 3. If the foundation be destroyed, what then can the righteous do? 4. The use of mass surveillance by the government is not justifiable because it fuels discrimination. According to a November 19, 2020 article in the Capital News Service, there are 2.5 times more police cameras in black populated areas than white populated areas in Baltimore. So you see, this increased the number of innocent black individuals being wrongly profiled, blamed, and arrested. And while the law states that everyone is innocent until proven guilty, mass surveillance treats blacks and other minorities as guilty until proven innocent. Therefore, an advocacy for mass surveillance is an advocacy for discrimination, and this threatens the oneness of humanity. Galatians 3:28. There are neither slave nor free. There are neither male nor female. We are all one. Our opponents may state that mass surveillance will make people act according to the law. However, an experiment by renowned psychologist Solomon Ash showed that surveillance breeds conformity. Surveillance breeds conformity because when people know that they are being watched, they alter their behavior to meet the expectations of the watcher. Then we have a white population walking, acting, and even thinking the same way. And this can only lead to one thing: the death of innovation. And a case of 2 heads are better than one becomes many heads thinking as one. Finally, they may also say, if you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear. But this is what philosophers call the fallacy of false dichotomy. According to this logic, then my opponent see no problem with Anadite, who is a Brownite, stalking on Erudite, who is a Kutite, while he's calling Delight, who is a Queenite, to come over and spend the night. In conclusion, our opponents may have knowingly or unknowingly proposed the destruction of national trust, economic downturn, and violation of human rights. But judges, audience, Esther 8:6, for how long shall we endure to see the destruction of thy people? Brethren, before we share the grace, let us act according to the book of Luke chapter 23 verse 24. Forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Now, let's share the grace.
Ladies and gentlemen, mass surveillance is just like watching a movie. The person watching is almost omniscient and omnipresent. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the cinema. The title of today's movie is Justifiability of Mass Surveillance. By the way, the cinema ticket is free. All you need to pay is attention. Season 1, Man of Steel. Ladies and gentlemen, we the audience all know without doubt that Clark Kent is Superman and not Lex Luthor. This is because we can all see for ourselves. And that is the case with mass surveillance. Since we can see for ourselves, an innocent man can never be mistakenly convicted for the crimes of another. The Innocence Project, a center on wrongful convictions, estimates that about 20,000 people are innocently convicted in the US prison. The Guardian on September 14, 2020 also recounts the story of a man who was innocently convicted for murder until his 37th year in prison, only for evidence to show that he was innocent all along. 37 years of suffering for what he knew nothing about. Ladies and gentlemen, the system is not perfect, but in a quest to justify the innocent, mass surveillance itself becomes justified. Judges, it is a good thing that my opponents are concerned about human rights. We are too. However, mass surveillance also helps human rights activists like us to get justice. With everything on record, we won't need to break a sweat. That takes us to season 2, Desperado. Audience, desperate times call for desperate measures. A normal problem requires a normal intervention. But you see, a massive security problem needs mass surveillance. For example, the World Population Review shows that countries like Afghanistan, Syria, and South Sudan are some of the most insecure countries in the world. If the government of these countries decide to embark on mass surveillance, how can my opponents say that what is an attempt to deal with desperate times is not justifiable? That stance is simply unjustifiable. Season 3, The Circle. Here, the protagonist, May Holland, made a profound statement. She said, people are of their best behavior when they know that they are being watched. This profound truth is supported by researchers in the University of Connecticut, a public land-grant research university. At this point, my opponents have said that mass surveillance will hinder free expression and may mask up people's true self. That's true. But if people's unhindered expression can lead to bad behavior or harm, and masking it up can protect lives and properties, then please, mask up. So, ladies and gentlemen, no matter how much my opponents try to provide rebuttals to this, the fact still remains that people behave better when they are being watched. In conclusion, I hope this profound truth becomes true of my opponents, who are reputed for always passing insulting comments on their opponents. Well, I hope that with this becomes very true of them. Because you see, at this point in time, I want them to understand that, dear opponents, you are being watched.
My opponents have come here today to tell us just 1/10 of the topic of today's debate. However, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, permit me to readdress the confidently addressed misquotations, misinterpretations, and brilliant distortion of facts. Walk with me as I ransom you from the random thoughts of the boys from Ransome Kuti. According to a survey conducted in 2018 by the University of Arkansas, it stated that crime rates have increased despite the installation of CCTV cameras in public places, a failed attempt at mass surveillance. My opponents have come to imply that there will be a reduction in crime rate, as people will avoid crimes if they know that they are being watched. However, this study has shown that the reason for committing crimes is due to an inherent nature of man. After all, despite the all-knowing and all-seeing ability of the Almighty, it still did not stop Cain from killing his brother. So you see, no matter the amount of eyes, whether virtual or real, it is still what lies in the mind that will propagate a crime. Audience, mass surveillance is not justifiable, as it gives too much power to an already powerful government. Information gotten through mass surveillance can be used by the government to blackmail political opponents, hence making them invisible. Audience, knowledge is power. Mass surveillance gives the government unlimited knowledge, hence giving them absolute power to deal with any authority that might have the audacity to stand as an adversity. In the words of Tom Clancy, if you can control information, then you can control people. Mass surveillance is not justifiable, as information gotten through mass surveillance can be easily manipulated to suit any narrative. Interestingly, we already have a federal government that withheld CCTV footages just to lay hold to their claims that no life was lost at Lekki toll gate. So it would then be illogical and highly hypocritical of my opponents to justify mass surveillance by this same government with a proven history of fact and data manipulation. Finally, audience, my opponents have come here to suggest that there will be proper regulations to ensure that no right to privacy will be trampled upon. However, according to an article published on Human Rights Watch titled, a US High Commissioner stated that the process of mass surveillance lacks transparency and there is no way to hold the government accountable. So you see, all we can do is allow them to survey, then hope and pray that they don't probe and see what they shouldn't. But this is as ridiculous as allowing UI install CCTV cameras in your various bedrooms and hope that the men behind the camera turn the blind eye when you are taking your bath. In conclusion, audience, today we agree that mass surveillance, that properly targeted surveillance, is a necessity for national security. However, the problem here is the indiscriminate collection of mass data, which infringes on the very rights of people that my opponents are claiming to protect. So you see, no matter the matter that my opponents will bring to this matter, it still will not matter, because mass surveillance should not be justified, and that is all that matters.
So now we have the rebuttal round, and we have our first speaker from Kuti Hall. Put your hands together for Ayo Salako Faithful.
Ladies and gentlemen, my opponents mentioned Privacy International to prove the point that the presence of mass surveillance is the absence of the enjoyment of the right to privacy and freedom of expression. But as I have mentioned in my speech, Privacy International is a biased body. This is why I gave a neutral definition by the Council of Europe, which states that the enjoyment of the rights to privacy and freedom of expression are possible in the presence of a mass surveillance system. My opponents also mentioned that it is expensive to practice a mass surveillance system, but that something is expensive does not mean it is not justifiable. The justifiability of a thing is determined by its necessity, not cost. I mean, if my opponents were buoyant enough and they had money to send their children to Harvard School, the necessity of very sound education will override the cost of sending that child to Harvard School. Also, my opponents mentioned that an advocacy for mass surveillance is an advocacy for discrimination. But as I have mentioned, mass surveillance involves the open collection of telecommunications, metadata, and conversations. There is nothing discriminate about the process. It collects conversations of everybody. Therefore, mass surveillance is not discriminate. Also, my opponents mentioned that it alters behavior. The only reason we are still alive is because behaviors have been altered. Without such authorizations, such life will be nasty, brutal, and short. This is why the aim of criminal laws is to promote deterrence. That is, make potential criminals no longer criminals. What was first a friendly advice, and I'll give as a strong recommendation to my opponents. You can try again next year.
Opponents have tried to make a point. They came close to making that point and still fantastically missed the point. My opponents have said that mass surveillance will strengthen security. However, according to the National Security Agency in the US, out of 1.6% of data collected, only 0.025% is selected for review, as the data collected is far too much and more than the available processing power of the security systems. So we collect a lot of nonsense to look for the sense in the nonsense. But the nonsense gets overwhelming, and the sense gets lost in the nonsense, and that makes no sense, hence making mass surveillance ineffective, and that is not justified. My opponents have come to argue that people already give out their data through mobile apps. However, that people are doing it is basically due to the fact that they have choice. However, with mass surveillance, the government takes away the choice away from them, thereby making it undemocratic. My opponents have also come to say that mass surveillance will be used to thwart terrorist attacks. However, in a 2013 interview by NBC News, a member of a White House review panel on mass surveillance revealed that no terrorist attack was thwarted using mass surveillance. So you see that point as K-leg. I'm sure it is vitamin D deficient. Finally, audience, the two speakers from Kuti have proven that mass surveillance, they try to say that mass surveillance is justifiable, but have said that their stance is wrong. And I want to say that even though they might be Kutites, two wrongs can never make a right.
So moving forward, we're going to have a musical performance by Kakaki. Kakaki, are you around?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be performing a common tune, All of Me, by John Legend. Of course, it's a common tune. I'm sure you'll be blessed with it. Thank you.
together for Kakaki. I mean, it was so emotional. I almost fell in love, but then we move. Moving forward to the faculty category, we're going to have the Faculty of Clinical Sciences versus the Faculty of Agriculture. If you are from Faculty of Critical put your hands together. They'll be speaking on the topic, the big brother role of the US in the affairs of African countries, interference or intervention. The big brother role of the US in the affairs of African countries, interference or intervention. While the Faculty of Clinical Sciences will be taking on interference, the Faculty of Agriculture will be taking intervention. Put your hands together as we call on the first speaker from the Faculty of Clinical Sciences, Jesujuwo Olaogun.
If you involve yourself in the affairs of other people, there are two things involved. You have either intervened or interfered. The Cambridge Dictionary defines intervention as getting intentionally involved in a difficult situation to improve it or prevent it from getting worse. On the other hand, it defines interference as getting involved in a situation where your involvement is not wanted or helpful. So before the big brother role of the US in the affairs of African countries can be considered an intervention or interference, we must consider if it was wanted and helpful. To establish our argument, we have several cases to cite. Case 1. The big brother role of the United States in the affairs of African countries is an interference because it leads to a chain of destruction. Case in point. The Cato Institute reported that 3 years before Gaddafi was killed by the US and his NATO allies, Libya had been relatively peaceful. 3 years before, healthcare was free. Now, about 2.7 million Libyans need healthcare subsidies. Education was free. Now, about 250,000 Libyan children are out of school. Ethnic violence was unheard of. Now, there is tension across all major ethnic groups, as reported by the African exponents. As if that is not enough, the Washington Institute reported that Libya has now been officially announced a failed state with no central government. Essentially, the involvement of the US and its NATO allies led to an unfortunate series of events. This is just like a neighbor setting a baby on fire just because the mother never stops complaining about the baby's cries. So the first question today is, the action of the US in Libya, was it helpful? No. Did it improve the situation? No. So I ask, if that is not an interference, then what is? Case 2. The big brother role of the US in the affairs of African countries is an interference because it leads to the exploitation of our human resources. Case in point. The UNICEF reported that 2 million children in the Democratic Republic of Congo are currently victims of child labor in the illegal mining of cobalt in the country. Interestingly, an article titled The United States and the Congo Crisis by Tom Fifield linked this problem to the continuous involvement of the US in the affairs of the country as far back as the 1960 Congo War, where they backed a coup to remove the legally elected prime minister in a bid to score points against the Soviets. 60 years later, Congo is still a war-torn country. In addition to this, Congo experiences the exploitation of 2 million of its children. So the second question today is, the action of the US in Congo, was it helpful? No. Did it improve the situation? No. So I ask, if that is not an interference, then what is? Case 3. History has proven that what starts as humanitarian rules by the US often become big brother rules and consequently become an interference. Case in point, according to an article by Lynn Wengrab, during the involvement of the US in Somalia, only 10% of the $1.5 billion allocated to humanitarian intervention was used for life-saving work. The remaining funds went into taking care of the 28,000 US troops occupying Somalia, making the involvement a disaster. A disaster response organization reported that it led to the displacement of 116,000 people, with 840,000 acutely malnourished children, and many years of economic instability. So the third question today is, the action of the US in Somalia, was it helpful? No. Did it improve the situation? No. So I ask, if that is not an interference, then what is? Judges, before my opponents try to confuse us today, let them know that while it is true that the US performs other rules such as the provisions of drugs and vaccines, financial aid, scholarship programs, and initiatives like YALI, these are humanitarian rules and are completely different from their big brother rules. The Oxford Dictionary defines a big brother as a person, organization, or government exercising total control over the lives of other people. So today's debate is asking if the US exercising total control over the lives of other people in other sovereign states in Africa is an intervention or interference. So the first question today is, when the US exercises total control over the lives of other people in other sovereign states in Africa, is it helpful? No. Does it improve the situation? No. So I ask, if that is not an interference, then what is? Ladies and gentlemen, even African leaders and the US themselves agree that their big brother rule is an interference.
One, according to the CSIS, the big brother role of the US has been called out by several African leaders as destructive to their economies. Two, in the Voice of America, in a 2019 report, reported that the motive of the US Assistant Secretary of State Affairs Office is to restore the dominance of America on Africa, and not necessarily for the benefits of Africa. Three, the Voice of America also said that the US Assistant Ambassador to Zimbabwe, Charles Ray, stated that the motive of the US foreign policy in Africa is to create more opportunities for America and not even for the benefits of Africa. So you see, my opponent are like the lawyer, pleading innocent for an accused who was caught in the act and has already admitted to his crimes. So the last question today is, having seen the motive of the big brother role of the US in Africa, is it helpful? No. Does it improve the situation? No. So I ask, if that is not an interference, then what is?
Ladies and gentlemen, my opponent may have botched the body of today's debate, but I am here to take over as the doctor in charge to rectify all their errors. But before we begin, let us distinguish between the two possible outcomes. Cambridge Dictionary defines interference as involving yourself in a situation where the involvement is not helpful or wanted, while it defines intervention as the action of becoming intentionally involved in a difficult situation in order to improve or prevent it from getting worse. Having considered these possible outcomes, kindly follow me in my medical examination as I prove to you that the big brother role of the United States in the affairs of African countries has only led to one possible outcome: intervention. First, let us examine the most abundant part, the skin representing African youth. According to Cities Alliance, in a 2020 article, almost 60% of the African population are under the age of 25. Sadly, this large population is crippled with unemployment, high crime rate, and a shut-up order from the government. This is a difficult situation. One of the ways in which the United States has intervened is the Young Africans Leaders Initiative, launched in 2010 to support thousands of young African leaders to spur growth, peace, and strengthen democratic governance. This has helped to shape the lives of African youth, but my opponents still feel that the U.S. involvement is not helpful. May we not be budged. Moving on, let's examine the economy, which is the heart of African countries. According to worldpopulationreview.com, 9 out of the 10 poorest countries in the world this year are African countries. This is a difficult situation. The African Growth and Opportunity Act is one way in which the U.S. has intervened in our economy. According to an article titled Strategic Importance of Agua, published by Cable Nigeria in 2020, stated that this act has promoted a free duty export and increased the two-way trade between United States and Sub-Saharan Africa by 5.8% from $36.9 billion in 2015 to $39 billion in 2017. Also, the US aid has set up trade hubs in African countries, which has created 46,000 jobs in Africa, 46,000 African jobs. This has helped to boost the economy of Africa. I repeat, may we not be budged. At this junction, my opponents might come to deviate from the big brother definition as the one we turn to, where we need urgent 2K or direction, inferring from the fictional character of George Orwell's novel 1984 as an all-powerful government or organization monitoring and directing the affairs of people. But just like the fictional character, that point is fictional and cannot stand in the real world because US possesses no such power. Next, let's examine the head, which is the health status of African countries. The COVID-19 pandemic has left African countries helpless with no proper plan to salvage the situation. This was a difficult situation. And even though our death rate was not as high as other countries like US, the US still intervened. According to Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, in an article in July 2021, the US, with African Union and COVID-19 vaccine global access, pledged to donate 25 million COVID-19 vaccines to African countries. And in the worst of Strive Mashiua, an African Union and Special Envoy stated that we appreciate the United States government for their support in helping to contribute to the African Union's target to vaccinate 60% of Africa's population. I repeat, may we not be pushed. Finally, in the 1994 Rwanda genocide, on which the people of my opponent's mindset dissuaded the US from intervening, This led to the death of 800,000 citizens and tens of thousands fled to the hand of cholera, according to a U.S. Bill of Rights Institute titled titled U.S. Policy in Somalia and Rwanda. In the same article, the United Nations stated that only the U.S. had the power to rapidly deploy a large enough force to stop the genocide. No wonder that when United Nations mission, France, Germany, Belgium all tried to intervene, all their efforts were in vain. So you see, following my opponent's stance in today's debate will only lead us astray. Bringing this medical examination to a close. 1, creating a platform for the youth, the U.S. intervention. 2, improving our economy, the U.S. intervention. 3, helping us in our helpless medical crisis, the U.S. intervention. 4, conflict resolution, the U.S. intervention, and intervening as the doctor in charge to fix my opponent's blunt speech. I'm Teresa Adekunle.
Res ipsa loquitur. The fact speaks for itself. Ladies and gentlemen, we can describe the last 5 minutes as a lot of things, but being truthful is definitely not one of them. Men lie, women lie, but the facts don't. So please, let's stick to the facts. Fact, the big brother role of the US is an interference on the economies of African countries. Fact check, according to an article by African Renewal, in 2016, East African countries agreed to a ban on the importation of used clothes in a bid to develop their local textile industries and improve their economies. However, the US, in the big brother role, threatened to retaliate, and they did this by placing the eligibility of these countries to trade freely with them under review. Now, this occurred at a time when the USA reports that the loss of that eligibility could cause the loss of over 219,000 jobs and could have over 500,000 people without income. So you see that the consequence of the US interference in Africa would only cause dependence, and whoever would argue for this must only show gross incompetence. Res ipsa loquitur. The fact speaks for itself. Fact, the big brother role of the US is an interference on legislation, and this will lead to an abuse of power. Fact check, according to an article by the New York Times, Michael Akonji, director of programs for the gay rights movement in Nigeria, has said that the US involvement affected advocacy efforts of gay rights because instead of creating more room for negotiation, it only worsened the idea that homosexuality was a foreign concept being imposed on Africa. Also, according to the Reuters in 2014, the US denied foreign assistance to Uganda and canceled a military exercise over anti-gay law. Now, while my opponents might argue that this is an intervention for gay rights, before anything else at all, this is first an interference on the affairs of an African country, and that is the topic of today's debate. Res ipsa loquitur. The fact speaks for itself. Intellectual audience, let us consider this. Imagine we ask my opponents what the role of Mr. Adeola Olajide is as their faculty president, and they come here to tell us, oh, he's an amazing student, a fantastic roommate, or a fantastic sibling. They would have fantastically missed the point of that question, or probably had no answer at all. So you see that while my opponents might come with a long list of the other actions of the US, including their supposed humanitarian role in our healthcare, education, and finance, that is a lazy attempt to distract us from the focus of today's debate, which is not on the humanitarian role, but on the big brother role. Fact, the big brother, as defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is the leader of an authoritarian movement. So evidently, any argument that my opponent brings that does not show an authoritarian role, be it humanitarian, military, or financial, is just a distraction from today's debate. Res ipsa loquitur. The fact speaks for itself. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the US flag may contain red and white, but the US, they are not Father Christmas. And let's say they are, even as kids. We never got anything from Father Christmas for free. So you see, that even if we go from October through November to December, what I want you to remember is that for every yam tuber the US gives, there is an agenda that my opponents cannot decipher.
When a person is in a difficult situation, it is only women that will offer a helping hand. Ladies and gentlemen, this is intervention. Do not allow my opponents give it a misrepresentation. Like other countries, African countries are sovereign and can legally prevent intervention without due consent. However, today's debate is not about questioning the big brother role of the United States, but about asking if this role seeks to improve African countries or not. Now, the US Department of State states that most African countries have received significant assistance from the United States, which means that the United States has played a very important role in the development of many African countries. However, if my opponents still want to seek justification for legality and consent, I'll give it to them. Clearly looking at it, most of the situations that require intervention are usually due to bad governance. And the African Union for Constitutive Act shows that this same bad governance is a premise for intervention. So, clinical scientists, on legality and consent, you have no point. Audience, I have come to allay your fears that the US is selfish, hence interfering. But the US understands the words of Martin Luther King Jr. That injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Hence, a 2014 December 17 journal shows that the United States only gets involved to protect human rights. Also, situations that usually require involvement, such as trafficking, terrorism, a pandemic, don't usually respect borders, which means that this can affect the country without significant and cause significant damage. Also, ladies and gentlemen, we must understand that the United States is a world power, and because of this plays a very important role in many countries. For example, according to an article published in April 16, 2016, titled Ebola, the Recovery, the United States was the world's largest donor to contribute to the Ebola outbreak, to contribute to the Ebola outbreak, and this resulted in serious, and this was definitely a product of intervention. So if my opponents call it interference, please let them know that they are not true. Finally, I understand my opponents are zealous, and I can see it. But as a big brother, I have come to offer knowledge to their zeal, because zeal without knowledge is often dangerous. Hence, this is intervention.
Judges, as expected, my opponents from the Faculty of Agriculture have fantastically missed the topic of today's debate. When my opponent said that the US sent vaccines to Nigeria to combat coronavirus, that is an humanitarian intervention. When my opponent said that the US sent financial aid to African countries to help them, that is an humanitarian role. When my opponent said that the US provided jobs for several Africans, that is an humanitarian role. But when the US backed the killing of Patrice Lumumba because of Congolese oil, as reported by The Guardian, that is a big brother role. The big brother role can only be an interference. To put this in perspective, imagine if the Faculty of Clinical Sciences had a meeting at UCH today and decided that all by ourselves that the Faculty of Agriculture Students Association needed help. Then we go ahead to seize the president of the association, cancel the faculty week, and suspend their constitution. Even my opponents will only find that insulting, but they will definitely find it unjust, unnecessary, and definitely an interference. My opponents argue that the big brother role of the United States is good for our economy. But the CSIS reported that the big brother role of the United States has been called up by several African governments as destructive to their economies. So in conclusion, dear opponents, having properly educated you on the topic of today's debate, the involvement of the US in their big brother role in Africa, is it helpful? No. Does it improve the situation? No. So I ask, if that is not an interference, what is?
Opponents have come to take us down the memory lane. They say that the US involvement led to the displacement of people in Somalia. But they need to understand that the basis for interference is in a difficult situation. However, if it doesn't get better, it doesn't mean that it wasn't an intervention, as the intention is to make it better. According to Brookings.edu, most critics of the Libyan intervention fall short because as much as it is true that the intervention did not produce something resembling to a stable democracy, but this is, however, wasn't the goal. The goal was to protect citizens and prevent a massacre, of which the UN intervention succeeded. Also, the Libyan issue was a difficult situation and should not turn the US from being a good Samaritan to a bloody Samaritan. Also, Merriam-Webster dictionary defines big brother as an older brother, a man who serves as a companion, father figure, and a role model. And US as a world power serves all of this. So my opponent bringing only a definition of the big brother, of which we have said does not exist, is a one-sided story and a desperate attempt to win in today's debate. Their Faculty of Clinical Sciences, we expected more.
Battle is getting hot and hotter. Moving forward, we're going to have the debate between the Faculty of Dentistry and the Faculty of Arts. Put your hands together.
On the topic of today's debate, it is understandable that most of us would have our biases. Some of these biases most definitely form the basis of my opponent's stance today. However, allow me, as we objectively assess the topic and clarify all misconceptions my opponents may propose, intellectual audience, today's debate is only happening because of the misconception that all women should be the same. But let us consider this. A white woman may have less melanin than a black woman, but she is still a woman. A physically challenged woman may be different from an able-bodied woman, but she is still a woman. And if my opponents still don't understand this, we would explain it to them like A, B, C. So dear opponents, pay attention. A for adjective. Whether white or black, able-bodied or disabled, biological or trans, clearly these adjectives only describe the type of woman. But in the end, a woman is still a woman, according to Healthline. A trans woman is a woman who was identified male at birth, but has a strong female sense of self, and so identifies as one. So while this adjective proves that a trans woman is different from a biological woman, a trans woman is still a woman. B for brain. Dr. Julie Baker, a neuroscientist, after using the magnetic resonance imaging scans to assess brain activation patterns, confirms that the transgender brain is structurally and functionally similar to the brain of the gender they identifiers. This is because, unlike a trans woman's body, her brain did not undergo masculinization at birth. So you see, to discriminate based on sexual organs is not allowed because, after all, being in the Faculty of Arts doesn't make you an artist or an upcoming Davido. Esteemed audience, now that we have established that trans women are women also, it is only ideal they are allowed in female sports. For these reasons, C for civil rights. Contrary to what my opponents would like you to believe, today's debate is not about sexual organs. It is about civil rights, according to a report published on Sports Integrity Initiative in June 17, 2019. Trans women are to be recognized as females in all purposes, including sports. So you see, disallowing these women in female sports is an infringement on their right to participation in sports and their rights to freedom. D for discrimination. Genetics as a factor has never placed everyone on equal footing, and it makes logically no sense to discriminate against people based on natural biological factors, because in fact, many elite athletes have natural physical advantages. A 2020 article titled 30 Amazing Current Athletes with Advantages clearly proves that Usain Bolt has very long legs and the advantage of a sprinting gene called the ACTN3, helping him become the fastest man in the world. So also Michael Phelps, who has giant arms and hands and double jointed ankles and shoulders, helping him become the greatest swimmer in the world. So you see, this is not a case of this is not a case of fairness in sports, but a case of targeted discrimination. E for exposure. Esteemed audience, the argument against trans women inclusion in sports is primarily because of their levels of exposure to testosterone. However, according to Scientific American, about 400 million biological women have naturally high testosterone levels. My opponent's stance in today's debate would then mean that these women also be disallowed in female sports simply because of a natural condition they didn't choose to have. So you see, that testosterone argument is like breakfast. It will surely go round. F for fallacy. My opponents may say that allowing trans women in female sports opens the way for many biological men to begin identifying as women just to compete against women. However, this fallacy would only be believable if we were all transphobic. Or from the Faculty of Arts, in 2004, the International Olympics Committee adopted the Stockholm Consensus to allow trans athletes who had undergone sex reassignment to participate in the Olympics, and later put a cap on the testosterone levels for trans women athletes. Since then, over 60,000 athletes have participated in the Olympics, and only 4 of them have been trans athletes until now. It is evidently ridiculous to then think that many biological men will willingly go through exhausting transition processes, such as hormone replacement, gather the required medical and physiological proof of their fake gender
gender dysphoria and go through their entire lives living under the pretense of being female, all while facing the prejudice that trans women face daily, only to play sports. Finally, in the spirit of sportsmanship, join me in welcoming my opponents from the Faculty of Arts as they come to sing songs of prejudice, paint images of bias, and act scenes of hatred. However, no matter the beats, brush, and costume they bring, it still won't justify their stance in today's debate.
We all know that the University of Ibadan is the most sought-after federal university in Nigeria. But to be able to gain admission, you must meet the requirements. Today's topic asks us whether trans women should be allowed in female sports. But I would suggest that we replace the word allowed with admitted, so that we can ask ourselves a more familiar question. Should trans women be admitted into female sports? And what is the cutoff mark to be female? Dictionary.com defines female as a person who possesses 2 X chromosomes in the cell nuclei, a vagina, a uterus, and ovaries. A trans woman, however, is a woman who was assigned male at birth. She possesses none of the characteristics mentioned prior, and so by definition alone, the answer to this debate is crystal clear. Before you can be admitted into female sports, you must first be female. It is important at this point to note that there is a difference between sex and gender. The WHO states that gender is used to describe the characteristics of men and women that are socially constructed. This is why the phrase, be a man, is a request to show attitudes that are recognized as masculine, not to develop male parts. Sex, however, is said to be biologically determined and uses the terms male and female to show these biological differences. A trans woman is indeed a woman, but her body remains male. And so long as the umbrella term female remains in female sports, a person who isn't female should not be allowed to compete. It is important to also note that it is in the interest of fair play that trans women are not allowed in female sports. A fair game is recognized as one that gives an equal chance of victory to all parties. But the chances of victory in a sports competition between trans women and females is not equal. This is because the natural levels of testosterone produced by a trans woman's male body is much higher than the levels found in females. MedicalNewsToday.com states that the average male produces 14 times more testosterone than the average female. And since testosterone is a major determiner of strength and physique, trans women are far more likely to be bigger, faster, and stronger than females. My opponents may say that trans women are mandated by sports bodies to reduce their testosterone levels to the levels of females by undergoing a therapy known as HRT for 12 months before they are allowed to compete. However, a study carried out by the British Journal of Sports Medicine concludes that trans women continue to show marked athletic advantages over females even after 3 years of undergoing HRT. The reason is simple. Simply reducing a person's testosterone levels does not reverse all the effects testosterone has already performed on the person. The changes effected by HRT are not enough to level the playing field between trans women and females, as trans women continue to enjoy some of the benefits of their initial levels of testosterone even after it has been reduced. With or without HRT, trans women have an unfair physical advantage over females in sports, and this is why they should not be allowed to compete. My opponents claim to be defending the rights of trans women, but even trans women stand to lose substantially if they're allowed in female sports. This is because the HRT mandated upon them by sports bodies comes with significant cost. A Vogue magazine article titled, "You Won't Believe How Expensive It Is to Be a Transgender in America," states that HRT will cost the average trans woman over ₦500,000 per year and must be taken continuously for the rest of her career to maintain the reduction of her testosterone levels. And how about the health risks? As another study carried out by the Kaiser Health System concludes that those on HRT may have greater risk of stroke, blood clots, and heart attack. This means that just to participate in female sports, trans women must undergo procedures that are not only expensive, but may have significant health implications. Should sports devolve from being an activity that increases a person's overall health to being an activity that increases their chances of a heart attack? And what would happen to trans women that cannot afford HRT? Perhaps my opponents are thinking that the government can help trans women in the procurement of HRT. I must remind them that even female sport is underfunded, and the chances of the government, individual governments, bearing the burden of HRT procurement is unlikely. After all, it wasn't that long ago that Nigerian athletes had to pay their own transport fare to compete at the Olympics. Is it the government that cannot pay your transport that will be able to pay for transport? The enforcement of HRT on trans women excludes those that cannot afford it and increases the health risks of those who can. Trans women should be placed in categories where they don't have to depend on drugs to just in the name of fair play, where their natural strength levels does not constitute an unfair advantage to their opponents. Placing them in separate categories, perhaps under the larger woman umbrella, is a healthier, safer, and cheaper option. Finally, distinguished audience, you can see that our objection to trans women in female sports is not born from transphobia. Both trans women and females will lose substantially if the differences in their biological configurations are not acknowledged in the world of sports. Prioritizing a person's gender identity over their physical ability will lead to a cavity in the teeth of justice and fair play in female sports for all eternity. And this cavity is obviously far beyond the reach of the Faculty of Dentistry. From the Faculty of Arts, I am Gold. Thank you. Esteemed audience, my opponent's argument in today's debate will be based on the physical strength and the dangers trans women may pose in female sport. They are simply suggesting that trans women should be disallowed in female sports because of their physical strength, when it is common knowledge that not all sports require physical strength but mental strength. These sports include chess, ludo, scrabble, and so on. Except they are implying that trans women have more mental strength than biological women. So you see, there is certainly no justification to disallow trans women in female sport. There is hatred, there is wickedness, and there's my opponent's stance. Judges, today's debate is simply asking, should trans women be allowed in female sports? Allow means a lot of things, but limiting it to mean allowed to compete against biological women is not one of them. Trans women can be allowed in female sports to pick up roles as referees, coaches, assistant referees, sport directors, and even members of the medical team. Clearly, my opponent stands against inclusivity when the world of sport, regardless of gender, is moving towards it. We now see women picking up roles as referees and assistant referees in men's sport. Also, we see men picking up roles as referees and assistant referees in women's sport. So whether my opponent considers a trans woman a man, he is not going to be the first in female sport. And if they consider a trans woman a woman, she is not going to be the first in female sport. My opponent only have a problem with transgenderism. So you see, there is certainly no justification to disallow trans women in female sport. There is hatred, there is wickedness, and there's my opponent's stance. My opponent may come to argue that trans women have undue advantage. However, according to an article titled Performance in Sport, published in Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Sport on November 15, 2015, it was stated that intense trainings and techniques are key ways to improving one's performance. It is simple. If Bobrisky after surgery start playing tennis, there is no juju that can make her beat Serena Williams if she does not train to attain the skill Serena has. So, while Bobrisky might have been born with a penis, without training, she will not be able to play tennis. So you see, there is certainly no justification to disallow trans women in female sport. There is hatred, there is wickedness, and there's my opponent's stance. Finally, my opponents may propose a separate sporting category for trans women instead. However, this defies logic in its simplest form, because they are simply suggesting that for every student that crosses from the Faculty of Arts to law, a separate classroom should be built for them and separate lecturers assigned to them, simply because their JAM forms did not indicate law. So you see, this is logically flawed, esteemed audience. Clearly, there is absolutely no justification to disallow trans women in female sport. There is hatred, there is wickedness, and there's my opponent's stance.
The battle is far from being over, as we have the second speaker from Faculty of Arts, Okudiri Chinechere. Put your hands together, we are Faculty of Arts.
Ladies, gentlemen, and those who identify as none of the above, the logic of my opponents is simple. They believe that because trans women are women, disallowing them from competing with females in sports is an infringement of their right to association. But a simple look at sports in general will show that this assertion is faulty. Even in male sports, where sufficient physical advantage is naturally enjoyed by certain sportsmen, classifications are made to balance these advantages. Anthony Joshua and Floyd Mayweather are both boxers, but can't be allowed to compete with each other in a boxing ring because they belong to different weight classes. If two males who share the same sex and gender can be disallowed from competing with each other to ensure fairness, isn't it logical that the same steps towards fair play be maintained in female sports? Simply put, sports does not separate males and females because of their differing gender identities. It separates them because of their differing physical abilities. The fact remains that trans women are not female and should not be allowed to participate in female sports. After all, water is a substance that can be identified in any state, gas, ice, or liquid. But because water can identify as ice does not mean you will use ice to make hot tea. Ladies, gentlemen, and those who identify as none of the above, Christian Gunderson, in a paper published in the National Library of Medicine, opines that trans women who have been exposed to higher circulating levels of testosterone than cis women have higher myonuclei, which are retained for prolonged periods after hormone therapy. Despite decrease in muscle mass, it gives them a retained advantage, as the nuclei represents an important memory of previous strength. This means that even if Adam, who has chromosomes XY and not XS, transitions to Ada via hormone therapy, Ada's muscles still remember that she was once Adam and can't lose the already elevated ability to build muscle. This will only make trans women superheroes in female sports, as they are literally X-Men. See, my opponents want an integration of trans women who are XY and females who are XS, but even the laws of mathematics disagree with them. As with every dy, dx, you must show a differentiation. Audience, judges, the fact remains that trans women are not female and should not be allowed to participate in female sports. Audience, judges, the underlying logic of my opponents is that we should allow trans women participate with females in sports on the grounds that they strongly identify as women. If we should run by their logic, ignore physiological differences and instead classify athletes by the gender they identify with. We must remember that as of this moment, there are over 57 gender affiliations people identify with. How then do we cater for the bigenders, the gender neutrals, the gender fluids, the pangenders, and even the agenders? What will be the agenda in a gender sport? We cannot create sports categories on subjective feelings that are subject to change. In conclusion, I am not saying that trans women are not women. I am simply saying they should not be allowed to participate in female sports because they are not females. But if my opponents still find it hard to understand, let me explain to them that the fact that they identify as winners does not mean they will make it past this round.
We have now gotten to the rebuttal stage, and we are going to have the second speaker from the Faculty of Dentistry, Akinjola Akiolu. Put your hands together.
Judges, my opponents have clearly shown up to the wrong debate. As today's debate clearly states, should trans women be allowed in female sports? Not participate. Also, our opponent insisted on sexual organs is worrisome because do we then say women born with congenital absence of sexual organs known as vaginal agenesis and women who might have lost their sexual organs to cancer or other medical complications are lesser women or not women at all simply because of the absence of sexual organs, therefore should also be disallowed? Also, our opponents have said that the involvement of trans women in female sports would be unfair to biological women. However, they should know that sports have regulations that are binding on all participants, and few of such regulations are the mandating of hormonal therapy for at least a year to reduce testosterone level, and also the presence of lightweight and heavyweight categories, so as to ensure fairness. But if they still insist as an unfairness, maybe that person needs the not sport, but rather ambiguous and undefined things like dramatic art.
Put your hands together for the second speaker from the Faculty of Arts, Okudiri Chinechere, as she comes for a rebuttal.
Audience, judges, my opponent said that trans women identify as females, but we've already established in our speech that trans women are women and not females. Female is a sex, and woman is a gender. Our opponents also said that 400 million females have higher testosterone levels, which gives them than other females, but that is just 1% of the entire female population. Besides, 400 million females having higher testosterone levels does not mean 400 million females are participating in sports. Besides, within these 400 million females, less than 0.1% of them are athletes. Females who have higher testosterone levels are asked to reduce their testosterone levels in sports before they can participate. According to World Athletics, you have to reduce your testosterone levels to 10 or 5 nanomoles per liter before you will be admitted into female sports. Thank you.
Let's do a little bit of something. We've come to the end of the faculty category. So if I call your faculty, I want you to give me, in your loudest voice, a big yeah. Faculty of Clinical Sciences. If you're from Faculty of Clinical Sciences, make some noise. If you're from the Faculty of Agriculture, let me hear you say yeah. And of course, we have the Faculty of Dentistry. If you're from the Faculty of Dentistry, let me hear you say, yeah, yeah.
And shut up. All right, so it's really a great pleasure to be here. We've really witnessed really lovely debates today. I know that we may have had some experiences with like listening to some of the speakers, but I believe that all the speakers deserve a round of applause. So please let's just, it's really not easy. That's going to be a lot of, rehearsals, a lot of group efforts and group work. So I'll be announcing the results right now. But I think before I announce the results, I think for those that will be going to the finals, just like some feedback, first you should ensure that your second speaker is not repeating what the first speaker is saying, because it happened a couple of times today. So like first speaker comes and then says something, and then second speaker comes, says something that is similar to what the first speaker spoke about. So I think that should be well noted by our finalists that will be announcing. So I would start from the debate between, I think we should do that last. Okay, so Dentistry versus Faculty of Arts. So Faculty of Dentistry and the Faculty of Arts. So we have an average of 81.75% for Faculty of Dentistry.
Faculty of Dentistry scored 81.75%.
81.75%. The Faculty of Arts.
Faculty of Arts
had
82.41. And the winner is Faculty of Arts.
Let's calm down. Okay, so we have for Clinical Sciences and Agriculture.
Faculty of Clinical Sciences versus Faculty of Agriculture.
So Faculty of Clinical Sciences and Faculty of Agriculture. Clinical Sciences had an average of 82.25%.
Clinical Sciences scored 82.25%.
And Faculty of Agriculture had
74.83. And the winner is Faculty of Clinical Sciences.
Not take my hands off you. Tell me how.
So we have the battle between. Okay. So please let's calm down.
Please, can we calm down so we can listen?
Let's calm down so we can
listen.
All right. So we have Awolowo Hall and Teda Hall. Awo had 77.08%.
Obafemi Awolowo Hall scored 77.08%.
And Teda Hall had 77.33%. So the winner is Teda Hall.
Teda Hall scored 77.33%. Our Hall scored 77.08%. And the winner is
Teda Hall. Teda Hall is the winner of that debate contest. So the last result is Kuti Hall and ABH.
We have Ransome Kuti Hall and Alexander Brown Hall.
So ABH had 83.75%.
Alexandra Brown Hall scored 83.75%.
While Kuti Hall had 80.58%.
And the winner is Alexander Brown Hall.
So we have Teda Hall ABH, Clinical Sciences, and the Faculty of Arts. Congratulations. The best speaker for the day,
Baby,
America Gold, Faculty of Arts. Congratulations.
love me or you hate me, know me. No mess with me, Mologo.
John Finals is taking place at ICC November 15. ICC November 15. John Finals.
Easy, fine boy like you, easy. You won't kiss somebody, follow sweet melody. Normally, oh, ojoojúmọ́ là ń ṣayé, oh, ah. Luckily, oh, olówó tí mo fẹ́ náà.
Predict and win.
Me,
Predict and win. What was his result?
I just want to be high.
Samuel, do we have Samuel here for the predict and win? Samuel, predict and win. Come for your giveaway, oh.
Who's asking for the results?